Hi, I'm Simon from Chat SDK. Today we're going to be looking at an issue that quite a few of our clients have got in touch with us about, and that is linking the pod file from your project to the Chat SDK. So if we load up this pod file, we can see that we have three development pods that we're linking to: Chat SDK Core, Chat SDK UI, and Chat SDK Core Data. Now, quite a few people are reporting getting this problem. No pod spec found for, in this case, Chat SDK Core and then the address. So let's look at why this has occurred in this instance, and also a quick explanation of why it occurs in general. So if we look at the pod spec, you can see that there's a difference between the first one and the next two, and that is because I've changed the address /chat/SDK core. These ones have the Chat SDK iOS in them. So if I add this back in, save, and now run pod install, then the project will install correctly and the pods will work. The question is, why does this happen? Why did that happen? Why did I get the issue then, and why did this fix it? And to understand that, it's worth looking at the project structure and understanding what's actually going on when we run pod install and what this actually means. So in the pod file, what we're doing is linking the pod file to the specific development pods in Chat SDK. And the development pods are stored in this Chat SDK folder, and we've got the three of them here. If you've seen the new Chat SDK setup video, you'll know why I'm not including Chat SDK Firebase adapter, and that's due to an issue with Firebase and Cocoapods, meaning that we have to either symlink this or add it manually. So for the process of this tutorial, I'm just going to ignore it. So let's look at how we can make our way from the pod file to each of those development pods. First, we need to go up a folder. Next, we need to change to the Chat SDK iOS folder, and then we need to change into the Chat SDK folder. Finally, we need to select the folder that we want, and inside you can see the pod spec. And this is really what we're linking to. The pod file is linking your custom project to the pod spec of each of these in the Chat SDK. So let's open this up and have a quick look. So in this, we've got a bit of info. Then the pod spec will look at which resources it needs to download. It also will look and see which dependencies it needs to also download for this development pod to work. So what we don't want to do is fill your pod file up with loads and loads of dependencies that the Chat SDK relies on. What we've done is split them up into development pods, so this pod relies on these three dependencies. When you add this pod, it will immediately download these dependencies and the pod will work. So now, to finish, how do we link this correctly, and how can we ensure that it always works? Well, there's a really simple way to do this and to work it out, and that is to think of the route between the pod file and the pod spec file as just a series of steps. So if I want to move out of a project, I just use this .. That means move out one. If I want to move into one, all I need to do is put the name of the folder. So for example here, move out of one, then move into the Chat SDK iOS folder. Move into the Chat SDK folder, and then finally move in this case to the Chat SDK Core folder. Now, if we had a slightly different project structure, it would be slightly different. Imagine now if we had a folder between the test project folder and the pod file folder. We'd then need to go back to get to the Chat SDK one. So in turn, we'd add this. We'd go outside of one, outside of two, and then once again into the Chat SDK iOS, Chat SDK Core project. Similarly, if we look in the Chat SDK iOS, if this folder was called Chat SDK modules, Chat SDK test, now let's see what happens. We go out and then we go in, and now this is looking for the Chat SDK folder, but that folder doesn't exist, so it will return an error. So in this case, we would change this to Chat SDK test. Chat SDK test, Chat SDK test. And this will work once again. I'll just change these back. So, as you can see, actually, this is very simple and it makes sense once you understand it. You're trying to create a direct line between the pod file and the podspec file. Each of these has a podspec file in, and so you want to tell the pod file where those podspecs are so it can download the correct information. Hopefully this video has helped, and hopefully you're starting to understand a little bit more about how Cocoapods and development pods work. If you have any questions, create a ticket on the Chat SDK page, and I look forward to making more tutorials for you in the future.